On behalf of the FSDR, I am delighted, honored, and thankful to introduce our second keynote speaker, Professor Dan Brockington from Sheffield University. He's the co-director of the Sheffield Institute of International Development at the University of Sheffield. His research covers the social impacts of conservation policy, natural resource management, the relationships between capitalism and conservation policy, natural resources, media, and celebrity in development, large-end studies of NGOs, networks, irrigation development, development data, and long-term livelihood change in East Africa. His books include Fortress Conservation, Nature Unbound, with Rosalind Duffy and Tim Igoy, Celebrity Advocacy and International Development, Celebrity and the Environment, and he has recently published with Peter Billy Larson, The Anthropology of Conservation NGOs. Please, let's join together and welcome Professor Dan Brockington.
Well, thank you for that introduction, and thank you very much indeed to the organising committee for this invitation to present a keynote lecture at the Development Days conference. It is a tremendous privilege for me to be here, and I'm very grateful indeed for the opportunity. I would like to present to you an argument about what I call the moment of development data. And I'm going to suggest to you that at this moment is notable for the prominence and power of development data. We have to recognize at the same time that this is a deceptive moment, that development data are as embedded and embroiled as ever in the politics and ideology which govern all forms of supposedly evidence-based policy. And that we have to be particularly attentive when the rhetoric of development policy is that it is going to be evidence-based, when we know that so much of evidence of development policy can in fact be evidence-independent. And I'm going to argue that the messiness of development data becomes particularly clear when we pay attention to the fact that a lot of what we're actually measuring are the proxies, not the actual things themselves we're interested in, but things which are like those things. Or sometimes, in fact, proxies of the proxies, things which are like the things which are like the things, and the chain becomes increasingly tenuous as we move along it. And at the same time, I'm going to argue that despite all these quite well-known deficiencies and problems about which face development data, there are other trends going on within development studies, important, vibrant, exciting trends. I'm speaking of the decolonization of development studies, which make it an even more exciting moment to take on these perennial challenges of development data. And I'm going to be illustrating this argument with a variety of different cases of research projects which are currently ongoing and which I've previously undertaken in order to bring these points home. And I'm looking forward very much to your challenges and questions in response to them at the end. Now, it is clear from 2015 that the need for the manifesto for development data up to notch with the arrival of the Sustainable Development Goals. The Sustainable Development Goals were derived from a more inclusive process than the previous Millennium Development Goals, with broader levels of consultation and broader engagement of the international community. The Sustainable Development Goals, as I'll illustrate shortly, also demand a great deal more data in order to measure progress towards them or regress away from them. And the Sustainable Development Goals are global goals. They pertain everywhere. Particularly interesting and important, of course, if we are, as we are now, focused on inequality. This is Piketty's data from the UK, US, Australia and Canada, showing the trends in inequality over the decades from 1910 to 2010, where we are now seeing levels of inequality which are reaching now levels which have not been seen since before World War II. And with this inequality come all the attendant problems of disadvantage, want, unrest and unhappiness, which we see every day in the politics of so many of our countries, which make the theme of this conference so particularly relevant and important. And the Sustainable Development Goals are global too, because the location of need and want is moving. This is Andy Summers' work, simply counting where poor people are in the world. And what we've been calling the least developed countries also now contain relatively less poverty than they did before, in the sense that more poor people are found in the lower middle income countries than in the poorest countries. The location of poverty is moving. But it is instructive to look in detail at the difference between the Sustainable Development Goals and the Millennium Development Goals, because I think when we do so, we can see precisely where the manifesto for development data is coming from. The Millennium Development Goals, as I said, far less comprehensive than Sustainable Development Goals, and also different in the targets that they set themselves. Let's just take the first. Eradicate extreme poverty and hunger. Here we can see straight away the difference between the rhetoric and the target. The rhetoric is eradicate extreme poverty and hunger. The target is, in fact, to halve it between 1990 and 2015. If we move on to the Sustainable Development Goals, then at least they're getting their rhetoric and their target consistent, in that the Sustainable Development Goal wants in 2030 to eradicate extreme poverty for all people everywhere, using a particular measure of poverty, this $1.25 a day. And so here we see the ambition, possibly unobtainable ambition of the Sustainable Development Goals, completely to remove poverty from the face of the planet. But we must also note, and I think welcome, that they're not just looking at poverty in terms of this $1.25 a day target. I think many of us here will realize that $1.25 a day is anyway a pretty extreme form of poverty. If we look at the $2 a day target, then all of a sudden poverty is increasing rather than decreasing, and we need to be aware of how arbitrary these targets can be. But that aside, let's also note that they have a second target associated with the Sustainable Development Goals, which is that they want to reduce by half, at least half, the proportion of men, women and children of all ages who are living in poverty in all dimensions and according to national definitions. Now this gets potentially quite exciting, because when we consider how broad and diverse these dimensions might be and how we might try to measure them, try to count them with all the cautions associated with measurement and counting, and how to recognize that diversity, and not just in the dimensions of poverty, but how these dimensions will vary from country to country. This, I think, instantly gives a very interesting mandate for development studies scholars to explore some of the diversity that poverty and the prosperity that it implies could be measured and could be explored. And I'll be turning to that in the second half of this presentation. So we have, in the Sustainable Development Goal, a manifesto. We have 17 targets, 17 goals. These goals have defined for them 169 targets. And there are 230 indicators which have been identified for us to track in order to see how we are moving towards or away from the targets set by to meet these Sustainable Development Goals. Now, this sounds all very organized and planned, and congratulations to the international community for attempting to be this transparent. But it is only an attempt. In 2016, the Centre for Global Development looked at how available data were to measure progress towards these indicators. And using the standards set internationally, they found that then 42%, now it's just over 50%, of the indicators were so-called Tier 1. That means they have established methodology and published data available for them. The rest are either Tier 2, which means they have established methodologies but no cleared published data, or Tier 3, neither methodology nor data available to measure progress. So we have an indicator which cannot indicate anything because it doesn't yet exist in the public domain. And this is just how the indicators might work generally in theory. For individual countries, their ability to produce data for those indicators is in fact quite compromised, and it's quite compromised where it is most needed, where there is most deprivation and want. So, the presence of the indicators, I think, ups the stakes. It creates more demand for more fact that as a development studies community we can respond to. And so you have challenges like this, which came out this month, the Data.org challenge, which is going to look for a $10 million of impact investment from crowdsourcing news sources for data scalable science solutions. Very positivistic, very numbers driven, I suspect. But nonetheless, demonstrating the demand for data. And we have to recognize too that we live in a time where there is a great deal more data available. I speak in part of big data, of the ability of the internet and our phones to harvest information about us and to make that available for all sorts of dubious political purposes. We speak too of the power and the possibilities of new satellite data. And this gets particularly exciting, especially if we consider the precision and both spatial and temporal, and the frequency with which satellite data now become available. And we've seen this in work we've been doing on irrigation, looking at the Food and Agricultural Organizations, the FAO's data on irrigation, which, when you get into the detail of it, is rather remarkable, because the FAO data on irrigation from their irrigation database is kept up to date up to 2005. And it uses methodologies which deliberately avoid, in most cases, satellite data. Because at the time it was established, satellite data were actually quite inaccurate as a means of measuring irrigation. And the method they have used before, which at the time was state-of-the-art, was to map known irrigation areas and to come up with definitive areas of where irrigation was known to be happening, and then to convert those maps into rasterized cells which give an indication of what proportion of a cell on the Earth's surface is actually irrigated. At the time, it's state-of-the-art. But that's up to 2005, and that was now quite a while ago. And it is, in fact, quite a poor method of counting irrigation which is not recognized by the state, or not recognized by large organizations which are promoting irrigation. Irrigation which is, in fact, practiced by farmers, where the development of irrigation is farmer-led, through their own wells, through their own boreholes, through their informal irrigation systems, which don't have fancy engineering works, but which can be seen from space, as you can see in this picture, using satellite data, where with radar data, and we've been collaborating with Casey Ryan and Sam Bowers in the University of Edinburgh, where radar data has a spatial precision of 10 square meters and a frequency of more than once a month, which allows you to track changes during the rainy season, which can see through cloud, because it's not dependent upon solar light, which can come up with a remarkable new set of numbers, and where we applied it using different algorithms to different parts of regions of Tanzania. We came up with estimates of potential irrigation activity which were between 2 or 3 times as much as that recognized by the state in some instances, but in others, in the major rice-growing areas, where our estimate of irrigation differed by 2 orders of magnitude from the official order of measures of irrigation. In fact, we have a situation now, and this work is led by Phil Woodhouse at the University of Manchester, where the government of Tanzania is struggling to work out where all its rice is coming from. It knows how much irrigation is happening, which is not very much. It doesn't know why on earth it is producing such welcome and huge quantities of rice. It's actually coming to Phil Woodhouse's project and asking them if they are able to explain where all the rice is being grown. Now, there are problems associated with this, because irrigation is a sensitive topic in Tanzania. Irrigation water competes with water used for hydroelectric power. It competes with water used for wildlife. And in some respects, as we're arguing, that the irrigating farmers in Tanzania have flown under the radar. They haven't been known, and they've been using water without having to declare it to the state. Now, all of a sudden, the radar data are making them highly visible. So becoming visible is not necessarily welcome. Introducing these data into fraught debates, politicized debates about the use of water in Tanzania is something we are extremely wary about. So I'm not welcoming freely and gladly the fact that we have all this extra fact and surveillance which is possible. I'm recognizing that it is possible to be much more accurate, and that accuracy can then be used for varying forms. So we have a manifesto in the Sustainable Development Goals. We have new means in the forms of new data and new sources of data. But we also have a mandate, and this mandate is particularly exciting for critical scholars of development studies and the social science community, especially because of the critiques which are being mobilized against the different forms of data and the uses of data, which make us, I think, give us a space and the freedom and the duty to think much more freely and creatively, but critically about how these data can be used and the purposes to which they're put. Some of the landmarks here I'm sure you'll be familiar with. We know of Morten Jerven's work in his critiques of the construction of GDP. And it's remarkable how long this took to come out in some respects. Because for us to measure GDP, we have to have an understanding of what the economy looks like. It's what the baselines are. And to construct a baseline, you have to survey your economy every 5 years or so. And Morten Jerven pointed out that this hadn't happened, and that some of the baseline surveys of underlying many countries' economies were in fact not 5 years old or even 10 years old, but as many as 20 years old. So these were baseline surveys which did not recognize the existence of a mobile phone sector, which could not recognize changes in the infrastructural sector, which made it possible then for the economy of Ghana to be completely revalued overnight, and for Ghana to become an upper middle income country. And where Ghana went, Nigeria followed the next year, because it was not going to become poorer than Ghana. So Morten's work showed that GDP data are, in many respects, thoroughly inaccurate and unbelievable. And he suggests all sorts of ways in which they could become much more accurate. We have, more profoundly than that, some of the most high-profile scholars, Joseph Stiglitz and Amartya Sen, with a forward from the French president, pointing out that GDP is a pretty poor measure to use anyway. Now, we all know this. GDP counts all the good things, all the bad things, all together, and counts the whole lot as progress. Robert Chambers points out that it's possible for a family to enjoy a meal from their allotment in the evening, to drink water, to play a game in each other's company, and contribute absolutely nothing to GDP. And it's possible for them all equally to head off to a casino, spend huge amounts of money on all sorts of inappropriate activities, get furiously drunk and probably consume all sorts of illegal drugs, have an accident on the way home, all of them be hospitalized, they have to have a new car, and the GDP will have grown enormously from all this misfortune. GDP is a poor measure of our lives, and with the authority of these Nobel scholars, we have more space to say that. This is an exciting moment, therefore, and yet we have to recognize that even though GDP is being criticized like this, economic growth remains fundamental and central to things like the Sustainable Development Goals. There is a dysfunction, a disjoining of the criticisms. And we can see this particularly when we come to the politics and ideology of development data. Because we have in this moment of development data then new landscapes which are composed of, on the one hand, the new sources, on the second the new critiques about the accuracy and veracity, and on the third, the conceptual challenges about the value of things like GDP. But when it comes to their politics and ideology, we can see that all these new opportunities are as embedded and embroiled in the difficulties as they ever have been. And this is in fact visible in the very text of the Sustainable Development Goals themselves as we compare them to the Millennium Development Goals. For example, the Millennium Development Goals set the target of achieving full and productive employment, decent work for all, including women and young people. that wasn't achieved, was it, by 2015? So what do you do if something's not been achieved? Do you question the target? Do you question the means by which we're trying to implement it? What action do you take? Well, in the case of the Sustainable Development Goals, what you do is you repeat exactly the same text with one or two extra qualifications. Now think how radical that could be. Full employment. Now this makes, I think, the Sustainable Development Goal community, well, it makes Bernie Sanders look like Ronald Reagan in comparison. What they're proposing here is a thorough reorganization of the way production happens and societies are organized. I mean, this is immensely exciting if we really are going to fulfill this. I think it's called the overthrow of capitalism. Now, I'm pessimistic, however, that the data which will be mobilized to measure progress towards that goal will achieve this end of full employment and the removal of capitalism. When we find that employment is not full in 2030 by the time the Sustainable Development Goals are reached, we will realize that there are limits, I think, to the possibilities of evidence-based data, evidence-based policy. This is something that I've come across repeatedly and frequently, and I want to emphasize this because in celebrating the moment of development data and the opportunities for us, I'm not doing this with any particularly rose-tinted spectacles or idealistic lens, because I've seen the limits of the blindness of policy to evidence right from the start. I began my research as a PhD student working in East Africa in landscapes like this. Was then the Mkomazi Game Reserves, now it's the Mkomazi National Park. And it's been a contested landscape for many years because of the perceived problems of environmental change and resource use that local communities were conducting in the area. And right back in the 1940s, district commissioners in what was then Tanganyika, British officials were complaining about pastoral resource use in these landscapes and claiming that the area was overgrazed, that this was causing desertification, and that soon this place of cattle keeping would become a place where only goats and camels were kept. And you can find records like this in the archives every single year, every single decade, until it was decided that the Mkomazi Game Reserve, which had allowed people to live inside it with their cattle, should be cleared of those people in those cattle, and that took place in 1988. To much celebration from the conservation community. But it occurs to me that if you are saying in 1940s that the landscape is overgrazed and degraded, and you say the same thing in the 1950s, and you complain of the presence of cattle in the 1960s, and you call for their removal in the 1970s, and you insist on their removal in the 1980s because the landscape is being degraded and destroyed, this implies to me that your cattle populations are in trouble. You cannot have cattle populations living on a landscape which is degraded and becoming a desert, and for those cattle populations to thrive. You must have that response visible in what has happened to the cattle populations, but what was happening to the cattle populations did not match the data or the rhetoric. Cattle were evicted from that landscape, and there are people who looked after them, 5,000 to 10,000 people, we think, around about 80,000 cattle, considerable personal cost, considerable loss to the local economy, considerable loss to households' livelihoods, to the gender relations within the households, because the data, the policy, was independent of any data. The data did not have purchase on the ideology of what these landscapes should look like. In an entirely different example, we can see exactly the same thing in terms of well, this is the attention to celebrity in the news and development affairs in the UK. We've asked hundreds of people, I think the sample size here was about 1,500 in the UK, about 7 well-known charities, all of which worked with celebrities very prominently. And we asked people if they were aware of these charities, and 95% were aware of the vast majority of them. And then we asked the same people, well, are you aware of these charities' work with celebrity? And celebrity featured very prominently in all of these charities' work. And 2/3 of people were aware of none of it. And the vast majority of people were aware of very little. Celebrity does not feature as strongly in the consciousness of Britons as you might think. This is a surprise, most not least to Britons themselves, and a journalist who was challenging me on these findings said this to me, and this, by the way, was a comment that he wrote down. It wasn't something that came out verbally. He said that we seem to be a celebrity-obsessed culture, and I grant him that. The British public seemingly has an insatiable appetite to know everything there is to know about A, B, and C-list celebrities. But just think about that for a moment. If that was actually true, the only thing in the British news would be about celebrities. According to this journalist, there is only one British public, the British public. We have an insatiable appetite, which means we cannot get enough of it. We want to know everything there is to know. This is, literally speaking, just plain wrong. Moreover, when I suggested, at the same time as my findings were coming out, there was a fascinating study by Brendan Cox, which looked at 20 years of development advocacy in the UK using celebrity. And Brendan pointed out that celebrity is a proxy for public engagement, even though in pretty much all cases the public are not actually engaged. If you bring a celebrity along with you, it looks as if you've got the public behind you. You don't, because the celebrity it doesn't command the public interest that people think they have. But the data about what people actually read and what celebrity news people actually consume isn't relevant here. What's relevant is the idea that celebrity works and celebrity reaches people. And because most of us think that celebrity reaches people, when we see celebrities present, we think that people are being reached. It's a self-fulfilling prophecy. It's the ideology which drives it. We can turn to another example, again from my country, because as you'll know, we're going through what's going to looks like a fairly prolonged xenophobic moment in Britain. And this is associated not just with Brexit, but also with hostility towards development, international development, development expenditure, our commitment to spend 0.7% of our economy on overseas development aid. And so we get very often the phrase in the UK that charity begins at home, that we should be spending our money on ourselves. And I hear that phrase so often, but I've never actually seen anybody tell me how much money is spent on home. And it's actually very easy to do because the data are publicly available and charities declare whether they work in the UK and overseas, or just overseas. And if you look at the data for England and Wales, what you actually find is that we're spending a lot of money on charity, £68 billion, of which almost 80% is spent entirely on the UK. So charity does begin at home for us. At the same time, the slogan is voiced as if charity is not enough money is spent at home. And if you count how much money of that actually goes on international development causes, how much of these countries outside the UK might be considered to belong to the global south, what we find is that's a total of around about £6 to £7 billion. In other words, just under a tenth of charitable expenditure in the UK is spent on developing causes. It's a small proportion. Charity begins at home, but the people claiming that it should don't know that it already does. We are, once again, in a discussion which is independent of any data. But then so too are the people who claim that xenophobia is threatening the financial basis of development NGOs in the UK, because once again, that has a very poor empirical basis. And I know that because we've tried to count the number of development organisations in the UK and how much money they're getting and the trends in their numbers and expenditure, and also where that money comes from. And what we find, and this is actually quite wonderful, is that the number of development organisations is increasing dramatically. The amount of money they're spending is increasing, and this is even more surprising, they're getting most of that money from the British public. And the British public are giving more and more of it. So we find that at the same time as Brexit is thriving and xenophobia is increasing and hostility to development is growing, so are funds from the British public towards development. It's very strange, but it gets even stranger, because you get more money from the British public as the British public gets poorer. The red line shows you income coming into development organisations from the British public, and the blue line shows household disposable income. I think what it shows is that there isn't, again, a single British public. We have a particular group of people who are giving to development organisations who I think are growing because of the fundraising activities of those development organisations, who are probably quite wealthy and idealistic and not so constrained by average household national income. When you interject data into debates about development NGOs, you get all sorts of surprising answers, demonstrating, in fact, that the debates currently are not particularly well data-driven. So, I hope I've demonstrated that I'm not idealistic about or naive about the dangers and the power of the politics and ideology governing data. But there's a particular issue which arises with respect to development data, about which we as a community, as scholars and people studying development, need to be aware. And this is that in many cases, we are dealing with only proxy indicators. We are dealing with things that which represent something we're interested in, but are not, in fact, that thing in itself. And proxies are particularly seductive, because once we start looking at a proxy, we can begin to say something we think is concrete about something which may in fact be intangible or rather difficult to measure. We use the proxy because the thing in itself is so hard actually to count and to plot changes in, at the same time as it's very important to try and get a handle upon it. And this is again apparent in the very text of the Sustainable Development Goals. Think about the things which really make us get up every day to go to work for, the things which keep us awake at night, the things that we would stop sleeping for because they matter to us so much, the things on the left of the screen as you're looking at. Things like dignity, things like freedom, things like justice, things like hope, the things which actually matter to us most of all. And then look where those things feature in the Sustainable Development Goals. And I've drawn a word cloud of the text of the Sustainable Development Goals and their targets and all their indicators on the right-hand side. Can anybody see freedom in that word cloud? Or justice? I mean, with word cloud software, I don't know how it works precisely, but if the word doesn't appear enough, then you don't get to appear on the word cloud. It's very democratic. Because freedom is mentioned in the Sustainable Development, in the text of the SDG goals and indicators and targets, and it's mentioned twice. So is justice. It's also mentioned twice. But there is no dignity. There is no dignity in the Sustainable Development Goals. Not once. And oddly, there is no hope. We measure these things instead through the proxies, which give us some indication as to what might provide dignity and what might provide hope. And I'll come in the conclusion, I'll reflect on how we might get more of a concrete fixing on as to what more dignity or more hope might be. Because the idea of measuring dignity in a way which you can count trends in is probably almost as alarming as the idea of there being no dignity at all anywhere in the Sustainable Development Goals. The problem of proxy comes up in things which we think we know much more about as well. And we can see this when we look at trends in poverty. I'm going to refer here to work that we've done in Tanzania, where we've been looking at what poverty constitutes and how poverty is measured in a country where measurement of people's lives can be very difficult. And I'm particularly grateful here that Sango introduced us to the longitudinal studies that you referred to, Sango, where you were coming back to an area that you'd been to 3 years previously. Because we also relied on longitudinal study for the work that I'm about to present. And it is, I find, extraordinary how rarely longitudinal studies are used in development studies. And it is a great shame because, as I think I'm going to show you, they can be extremely powerful devices. We can learn a great deal from them. But if you look for longitudinal studies in the literature, they are really rare. In fact, when you get a book which is about longitudinal studies, it will call itself a longitudinal study because there aren't any others. So, and we need them because in the graph behind me, we have, I think, one of the clearest trends that you find in the recent history of Tanzania, that in the black line you have economic growth. Now, accepting all the reservations that Morten Jervan has just outlined about the problems of economic growth, we have a 300% increase in economic growth here. A remarkable trend. And it's driven by changes in the mining sector, in the infrastructure sector, in tourism. And what we have in the red line is levels of the poverty line, the poverty data. And this shows that you have 60% of people who are not poor in 1991 and 70% of people who are not poor in 2007. So poverty rates of 40% declining to 30%. In other words, the poverty rate decreased by 25% by a quarter at the same time as GDP was growing by 300%. There is a massive mismatch that you can see in those lines. And this leads experienced scholars to say, well, how is it possible for the economy to grow and yet for poverty to persist? And particularly for poverty to persist in rural areas. And the problem we face, however, is that we don't have the longitudinal data. We don't have studies which go back to the same places, to the same families, to explore how people have fared during this time of neoliberal economic reform and yet persistent rural poverty. And we were able, in the project which is just being completed, to go back to communities which had been studied by researchers in the 1980s and the 1990s, and we went back to the same household, same families, the same communities, to look at how people had fared over in the intervening decades. And we came up with a serious problem. The serious problem being that the neoliberal economic policies that we had been trained and built our careers on criticising seem to have done a remarkable deal of good to rural Tanzanians. At least that's the gloss that I'm sure that the World Bank and others will be drawing from my research. It's remarkable how many of the researchers were alarmed at their findings. The thing is that we found forms of wealth that we could not explain and which were not well captured in the data because the proxy of poverty that was being used was inappropriate. Let me illustrate. This shows a village, Mtwisa, in 2003. I lived there for a year. Between 1999 to 2000. It's in southwest Tanzania in Rukwa, a very poor area. When I lived there, there were no roads into Mtwisa. You had to walk in, and it took 7 hours because you had to walk in down an escarpment, and it was even longer to get back, and you had to do that at night because otherwise it was too hot. In the wet season, you could be completely cut off. And when you got to the road, it was a dirt road, and it was another day's journey to the tarmac road. And so to get there was a 3-day journey. And it was impossible to sell your crops for a decent profit in that area because you couldn't move them out. And this was a place with very fertile soil. It had a lake full of fish nearby. It had immense potential and resources to become wealthy, but it was not so. And when I went back to Mtwisa in 2016, I was astonished at the changes. And not least, you could see the changes in the architecture. The picture here you can see has houses which are built of sun-dried brick and with straw. But in just 10 years later in Google Earth, what you can see is that people have built houses, and I've circled them in black here, with metal roofs. There is all sorts of wealth being generated in this community which is turning into new houses. In fact, you can see this trend in the very data which is being used to produce the poverty lines. The same household budget surveys which show that people stay poor also show that people are building good houses in Tanzania with modern walls and metal roofs. And so the paradox we have to explain is how is it possible for the red line of poverty to decline slowly, but for these same poor people to be wealthy enough to build houses? And the answer we find is in the means by which that poverty line is constructed, in the means by which the proxy is devised, because a poverty line is not poverty. A poverty line is a proxy for one dimension of poverty. Poverty lines in Tanzania are calculated by measuring consumption. Household budget surveys ask respondents how much money they spent in the previous week or previous month on things like food or education or water and clothes in order to find out how much money the household is spending on its needs on a day-to-day basis. Now this means that for good statistical reasons, if you buy something really expensive, like a metal roof, or like a computer, for example, then that would in fact be excluded because it's an outlier. So if somebody is saving up for their new metal roof on their house, they then purchase that metal roof for their house, that purchase would be screened out of the data because it is too much. It would make that person look richer than they really are. It's good practice. At the same time, you also have to miss out all the productive assets. And this, by the way, the quotation behind me is from the text of the Household Budget Survey instruction booklet that the National Bureau of Statistics releases in Tanzania, explaining that the outliers are excluded. And this text comes from the World Bank. And this text is explaining that you don't just exclude the outliers, you also exclude any investment in productive assets. So, and that means that if a peasant is buying land or a plough or oxen or things which will go in towards their farming, then that expenditure is excluded by the Household Budget Survey, because you must miss out your productive assets. And this, again, is good practice. If you're a shopkeeper and you're spending $500 a week on buying stuff for your shop, then you don't count that $500 a week for your household budget expenditure, because it's not your household, it's your business. You keep the expenditure on your business separate from your shops. Otherwise, people, again, would look far too wealthy. But when you talk to Tanzanian peasants and people in rural Tanzania, and you ask them what constitutes wealth, what does wealth and prosperity mean to you? They will say, well, it's our farms, it's our oxen, it's our ploughs, it's the things that make us richer in the future, it's our productive assets. So when rural Tanzanians get richer in their own eyes, the poverty line cannot count that. And what we were seeing in all the wealth that we found in Tanzania, not just in Rukwa, but in we went to 37 different villages, and not all of them, absolutely not all of them, but in many of them we found people to be wealthier. And they were wealthier because they'd invested in their productive assets, and that could not be counted by the development data statistics that were being used. And it's a great shame, because it's not just that people choose to invest in productive assets, but the way in which the economy works means that it's almost impossible not to. So when we were talking to a focus group in East Tanzania, they were explaining to this, and I'll read it to you, that they get money seasonally, that they maybe earn 3 million shillings or 2 million shillings, and then when people get that money in from their harvest, then they will buy a TV or solar panel or all manner of things. They will buy, you note here, assets, and they will use that money up, because if you keep the money in your home, it will get frittered away, or it will get stolen. But if you invest it in something that is less easy to steal, then you will keep that wealth. This means that if you're trying to borrow money from this person who's just harvested and got all this income in, then they're not going to be able to lend you that money. They'll say, come back in 5 months' time in the next harvest, because even if you want to borrow 200,000 shillings, then they will tell you, well, I've got nothing because I've bought a TV, I bought a plot, I bought bricks, I've invested in my assets, I've invested in the things which cannot count, which cannot be counted in the development statistics. Which is why when we went to counted the asset histories in Rukwa, in Mtuisa, when we asked people when they had built their houses, when they had put the roofs on them, when they had bought their oxen, when they had bought their small stock, their land, their ploughs, their carts, their milling machines, their motorbikes. And these, by the way, all reflect net investment. So this takes into account sale of land and sale of oxen. What we find is that asset growth has been increasing remarkably, and it's been fueled by smallholder production. Now, the implications of this are quite exciting, because we get similar results in other parts of the country. For example, this is from Gitting and Gotcho villages in Manyara, in northern central Tanzania. This is actually very close to the village where my wife is from, and this in fact explained the whole reason why we embarked upon this research, because I was reading a thesis written by Vesa Matti-Lewiski, a Swedish scholar, who wrote his PhD in the village of Gotcho, which is about 5 miles away from where I was living on sabbatical with my wife. And in Versa's thesis, the levels of poverty that he described were absolutely extraordinary. You can see them in the table behind me. 58%, nearly 60% of people were either poor or destitute. And the largest number of people, largest category of people was destitute. And when you look at the description of what destitute means, not being able to use your land at all, being entirely dependent upon others to look after you, not even being able to hire out your land for labour, I thought, this is ridiculous, because I'm living next door to this village, and this study is only 25 years old or so. Versa must have got his data wrong. I'm sorry, I do not recognise that form of poverty or those levels of poverty. I asked my wife, who is like this? And she said, well, nobody actually. And we talked to our other relatives. We eventually found one man in the village who had these qualities. Particularly ill individual who was looked after by his family. And so we concluded, well, if there aren't people like this anymore, then Versa got his methods wrong. And I talked to Versa about this, and I read his study, and he did his wealth ranking with 17 different informants. All of them men, all of them reasonably well-off villagers, but 17 people were ranking the village in this way. And this seemed to me to be reasonably robust. He then followed that up with household visits to these same study sites. So I found his data, in fact, to be rather believable. So where were all the poor people? Well, I knew that poverty had persisted in Tanzania. This was before we had done all this most recent research. So I knew that if poverty had persisted and these poor people weren't here, therefore they must have left. They would have sold up their land and gone. They would have been excluded from village society because they couldn't have got richer, not according to the theories that I'd been brought up on. And the unfortunate thing for my theories was that when we asked people, again, to profile the village, we found that according to local categories and local meanings of wealth, they had in fact become richer, local meanings of wealth which are so dependent upon their assets. And this was why we decided to replicate the study, to try and do it in many more sites, and to bring in this federation of researchers who were able to go back to their study sites to find that in many cases, yes, people had got richer, or in some cases, and again, this is Rukwa, where people had got richer and there had been an influx of poorer people who didn't have access to the land, who were selling their labour, where the dynamics get particularly complicated, and villages where, in fact, this new prosperity had not touched them. It's a particularly diverse story. So please don't think that I've just told you that Tanzanian villagers are really rich, when in fact they look poor. That's not what I've said. I've said that rural Tanzania has looked poor, according to one measure of wealth. And if you look at another dimension of wealth and prosperity, that of assets, then you find a slightly different picture. You find that people can become richer. And what assets will tell you is not the same as what measures of morbidity will tell you, not the same as what measures of education or gender equality or sense of well-being or aspirations and expectations and hope for the future. All of these dimensions of poverty and prosperity are different. All of them will require their own measure. We are ill-advised to use a measure of income or consumption or a measure of assets as a proxy for wealth or prosperity as a whole. We deceive ourselves if we try and do so. And this is the seductions of proxy indicators, because they, as I've already said, they obscure the things that matter to us most, the things like dignity. We forget where they've come from. We forget that poverty lines are based on consumption data. Now, I know this because I've asked now, I think about 180 people, critical development studies scholars, all of them, in 4 different countries, as to why poverty line data might omit assets. And of those 180 people, 8 of them knew about this restriction on productive assets. If you're an economist, you know this anyway. The instructions to exclude poverty productive assets are hidden in the back room of the World Bank website. But many of us don't. And since we're, about 50, 60 people here, and I need to increase my sample size to over 200 people who I've asked, could I just have a show of hands who knew already that productive assets are excluded from poverty line data built upon measures of consumption? Okay, I've got 3 people here, 4. I didn't at all until halfway through the research project, by the way. I was told this by the National Bureau of Statistics. Most of us don't realise this. We're all in good company. Thank you. I'm now up to about 230 people, 11 of whom knew about the provenance of poverty line data. This is why there is a moment and opportunity for us as development studies scholars, because as Morten Jerven showed us, so many of us showed, when we get behind the numbers, when we look at how they're constructed, at how they're misinterpreted, we find that they are oversignified, that people interpret far too much information than they can legitimately interpret, given where they come from. So, I'm over time, and I'm sorry for overrunning, but let me just conclude. We need to be sceptical about development data. We need to be sceptical about its politics, its origins. We need to be wary about about the dangers of development data, and not at all idealistic or naive about their possibilities. Any metrologists, the people who study measurement, will tell you that measurement is not just about counting things. Measurement is about transforming society and transforming mechanisms of counting so that things can become visible. It requires extraordinary transformations in order to be able to count anything at all. Measurement is an intrusive, transforming project. I'm thinking of the work of Theodore Porter, among others here. And I suspect the one thing worse than being measured, even than being measured badly, is not being measured, is not being visible, is not being able to count, because the systems which are trying to count you cannot see you at all. And this is where, and it is, apologies for mentioning this so briefly and inadequately at the end, but this is where the decolonisation of development studies becomes so interesting, because in fighting for juster, more effective, more accurate measurements that can be used more justly, we have to do our work, our development studies work, in a different way, and we have to decolonise the construction, production, and use of development data. This is very important to the work we're doing in the Sheffield Institute for International Development at SIID. And we are still exploring what that means. We're still discovering that, because it requires a considerable amount of unlearning and then new learning for us to work out how to decolonise. We know that it entails new forms of partnerships that have to work internationally. But we know that these new partnerships have to come up with the categories that matter, the concepts which matter, the things that need to be visible in collaborative ways. We know that the means by which they will then choose to measure and count these concepts and categories, again, will have to be worked out through collaborative ways which hand over power away from the global north, away from the usual suspects who tend to wield this power, in order that when we come to look to consider what the things that matter actually mean, what prosperity, well-being, and dignity actually mean locally, in order that we can know how better to promote them effectively through such decolonised means. Thank you very much indeed for listening, and sorry for overrunning.
Thank you very much, Professor Dan Brockington. It's always great to listen to you. And it's been a very interesting discussion about the construction of development data. I actually remember one of your earlier publications about the social impact of protected areas, where you slightly mentioned the lapses that come into place when fitting protected areas into these sort of bigger categories by international organizations. I would now like to invite Professor Irmeli Mustalati from the University of Eastern Finland to do the commenting remarks. Thank you.
Yes, thank you very much. It's a great honor for me to be here today. I have been actually following your work since my undergraduate studies. What connects us is that we both have been doing research in very rural settings in Tanzania. And the history there is long too. And of course, I might not go back to all these details in relation to Tanzania and also these changes what have happened. But yes, I could have a similar type of pictures from our case study from Liwale. It's really amazing the change what have happened in Tanzania since I started there in '93. But yes, what we need to understand is this complexity. We need to understand the proxy, not only when we talk about Tanzania, but also all other countries, also once we are doing research here in Finland. Some of us, we are very closely following up now in these development goals. First started with this millennium goals, and now are looking at the sustainable development goals. And actually we need to be very critical. Those are very mosaic type of understanding of the proxy. Mosaic type of the understanding the realities. And we need to understand that these development goals, what are the interlinkages? Those goals are actually denying that what is actually the reality. What is this difference between well-doing and well-being? Sometimes also our pictures are denying it. Yes, we can show the nice pictures and nice changes in those countries, but we also need to be a bit critical. All those nice indicators, those numbers, which now all the countries are running behind reporting. There is somebody from our minister as well, who well knows how difficult it is to collect all those numbers, report it and show those indicators that we have now done the change. We have now fulfilled all those required numbers. But actually, are we then forcing our partners towards this evidence-based development? Are we actually forcing them to doing well, rather to supporting them to be able to do and support the well-being? And this is also relation to I need to go a bit back to our own history in Tanzania. Not necessarily you, but many of us, once we are supporting these transformation processes. Öster Barry's presentation today, yes, we have recognized as well in research that we need to be more involved to activism. Take also the more active role to support these transformation processes. But we also need to be a bit critical towards our own data, our own numbers, what we are presenting. And like what you were also done mentioning, that the numbers, our pictures, our data, ethnographical data as well, it's power. And once we collect this powerful data, there is also the risk that we don't understand how the data is used. That we are actually sorry, Sangu, I know your work as well, and we have also this history. I can throw you with the pen. It's a bit like we are throwing these numbers to giving same time this responsibility for somebody who might not be able to carry those responsibilities. We are demanding the new duties from our partners, partner universities, the training. We might demand the new type of understanding of development. We might demand the transformation processes from our partners, which actually, once we are so eager to make this change, we might not actually understand that the capacities and capabilities are not the same thing. And this is something which I do think that it comes to, again, back to the proxies. That even if we might not work with the numbers, but we work in ethnographic data as well, it's always the proxy. It's always something we are understanding. It's our own interpretation, but the interpretation by those local people who live in those realities, but also our local colleagues might be very different. Iron roofs paid by the microloans in Tanzania might support the family to not get wet, but it might not support them to losing the land once they are not able to pay the loan back. So thank you for this opportunity to discuss these issues with you.
Before we move on to the question and answer discussion, perhaps you might have a response to the remarks.
Well, just to say thank you, Meli, for that response. You had a really hard job because I didn't give you my presentation beforehand. So I'm particularly grateful and admire the fact that you've been able to respond off the cuff like that, and apologize that I made you do so. I'm also aware that lunch began 12 minutes ago. Could I suggest then that when we come to the questions, that if there are questions which we can address now, then by all means ask them. It would be interesting to have the discussion. And if you want to do so during lunch, then I'm around. In fact, I'll be around for the for the full 2 days as well. Sure. Okay. We'll take a.
So you say that people more like celebrities who do charity, right?
Say that again, please.
So you say that people like more celebrities who do charities, right?
No, I didn't say that. Sorry.
What did you say?
I said that people don't recognize or know as much as we expect about the work that celebrities do for charities. The work that celebrities do for charities is not seen as much as we might expect it to be seen.
So basically people are not interested in charity, general public.
No, they are interested in charity. They're not interested so much in the celebrities who do work for the charity.
Okay, thank you.
There's a question behind as well.
Yes, so I think we also can connect what you say with what Irmeli said. That's question of capabilities and capacities. So what your presentation brings to my mind is that if we have a kind of system that is really hard working with these proxies, we get the kind of development we have in China. That, well, if population control is a problem, we control population. If growth is a problem, we make that growth. But then what we don't see in that kind of system, and also this, what kind of capacities are needed for governments or civil society organizations to make that happen. This is a very open-ended comment, but I hope you can join.
Well, thank you indeed for the comment. I do appreciate that. There's a question at the front as well.
Perhaps before.
Okay. Should we have the question?
Yeah. Thank you for that. I was just wondering, because we are going through a bit of the same thing in Finland with really dirty numbers, things like charity and where you put development money and you do development within the country instead of using the budget and so on. And from a perspective of a non-academic, especially do you see there's enough space for the experts to question their own data without, in a post-truth world, in a post-fact society, when the other side, so to speak, thrives on questioning data and its credibility? Do you think there's enough space to be questioning ourselves the data we produce, or do you see that happening, that you're not able to have a presentation like this outside of an academic context? What has been your reaction when you go say that I, as a social scientist myself, question our own data? Has that been manipulated and exploited like it has been here in our little bubble in Finland?
So whilst the microphone's moving forward, I can answer that briefly. Because, of course, it gets manipulated and exploited. That happens all the time. But I would also caution very strongly against thinking that you only get critical thinking inside academia, because I've had some of the most robust feedback on my research from the National Bureau of Statistics in Tanzania, who pointed out the mistake I was making with respect to productive assets. Working with NGOs and development NGOs in the UK is absolutely fascinating, because this is a super self-critical community, super intelligent. Who, when I was giving them an inch, would not take it. They would say, you cannot claim these levels of efficiency for our sector as a whole, because we don't have the evidence to prove that. So I'm actually, the more I work beyond academia, the more enjoyable it is, actually. So I should have said that here. Yes.
Professor, thank you very much for your presentation. My question is, do you think there is a middle point in between producing these very positive sort of numbers and measurements that allow us to compare between different contexts and these much more colonial, decolonized-based sort of measurements as you are contesting? I wonder because when we approach our research, obviously being trained in pretty much a Western sort of environment, we always have in our minds all these concepts and theories that are very, at least myself, which I'm an economist myself. So I wonder whether you find a middle point or how to find that middle point in between them, these two things.
Thank you. That's incredibly hard to answer, actually. I suspect partly because there isn't a middle point, there isn't a compromise. Instead, there's a tension. And there's the tension isn't resolved. As soon as you lose the tension, you've lost the point. And I'm reminded of one of the fundamental features about anthropological research that I was taught by an amazing mentor, Phil Burnham, who pointed out that when you're doing anthropological research, and in his case, he was living in a very remote area and learning a difficult new language and immersing himself in an environment. And after a certain period of time, he told me he remembered a point where he woke up one morning, got out, and he thought, actually, I know the answers. I understand things here. I've worked out what it was that I was trying to answer. He had understood local viewpoints to the extent that he could understand the world around him. When he tried to write it up and express it for anthropological audiences and in anthropological literature, he then realized that he didn't know all the things he had thought he'd known. He didn't know enough about the literature, he didn't know enough about the state, and he had to move between these sites. And it's in the tension and going to a place, immersing yourself and understanding it, that you realize what you do know, and then when you come to the environment where you're communicating it to a broader audience, that you realize that you don't. And the same principle, I think, would apply with development data. We're working with Maasai pastoral NGOs and Maasai pastoral communities now with Jim Igo and Caroline Howe in Imperial and Eli Furaha Laltaika and Saruni Parmelo, colleagues in Tanzania, trying to understand what dignity and heritage mean for pastoral communities, because this is a debate which is really vigorous within pastoral communities because they have so few cattle anymore that it's difficult to remain people of cattle and remain the same, keep the same traditions that people and the ideology that people have had for decades in current circumstances. So people are questioning, what does it mean to have a dignified future as a pastoralist, but with far fewer cattle? This is a strong, vigorous local debate, and we're tremendously privileged to be able to not so much to take part, but to listen to what people are saying. And there will be a huge tension when we try and communicate that work, as we're undertaking to do, to people who work for international organizations in the UN in Geneva, for people who work in government in Tanzania. And we have to keep that tension alive. So if I can push back, there is no middle point. As soon as we get to the middle point and try and compromise between no, we've lost the fact that you have to be alive to both possibilities and to both ends of the pole. And what is exciting about the decolonisation movement is that previously it was a communicating amongst the academics and amongst the policymakers which took privilege and the foremost position. With the decolonisation movement, then the source, the local views become much more important.